You wake to the smell of barley porridge burning on the hearth, your youngest child coughing 3 feet from your head, and your husband's mother muttering prayers in the darkness before dawn. This is Bruges, 1392. Your marriage bed is separated from 7 other sleepers by nothing more than a woolen curtain so thin you can see shadows move behind it when the fire flares. Last night, when your husband reached for you, his hand trembling with want, you placed your finger to his lips and tilted your head toward the sound of his father's snoring, a reminder that even breath could betray you. If you're finding value in these hidden chapters of history, take a moment to hit the subscribe button and leave a comment telling me which corner of the world you're watching from. It never ceases to amaze me that we can gather here, thousands of miles and centuries apart, united by our fascination with the lives our ancestors actually lived. Here is the paradox that governed intimacy for most of human history. The most private act required by marriage, the consummation, the touch, the whispered endearment, had to be performed in the most public of spaces. There were no locked doors. There were no separate wings. There was only the single room, the shared bed, the collective breath of a household that slept, ate, worked, and died within arm's reach of one another. And yet, marriages endured. Children were conceived. Love, that fragile, stubborn thing, found a way. The historical record does not document this easily. Church courts and manor rolls tracked marriages, dowries, disputes, but they did not record the codes that couples developed, the gestures traded across a crowded room, the timing of a glance that meant tonight or not yet. For that, we must turn to the margins of history, the architecture of medieval homes, the testimony of penitential manuals, the rare confessions recorded by priests, the letters exchanged between wives separated by war or plague. From these fragments emerges a system as intricate as any courtly ritual, a language of desire spoken in silence, practiced in shadow, and passed down not through texts but through whispered instruction from mother to daughter on her wedding night. This was intimacy as survival, love as discipline. Between the 12th and 15th centuries, across the villages of Flanders, the market towns of Tuscany, and the manorial estates of England, the architecture of domestic life reflected a single truth. Space was survival, and survival was communal. The nuclear family, isolated in its own dwelling, was an impossibility for anyone below the gentry. A Flemish weaver's household in the late 14th century might contain the master and his wife, 4 children, 2 apprentices, a journeyman, the master's widowed sister, and a servant girl, all inhabiting a structure no larger than 400 square feet. The great hall of a minor English knight housed not only his family but also retainers, household officers, visiting clergy, and seasonal laborers who slept on benches or straw pallets near the fire. Even among the Florentine merchant class, families occupied multi-story structures where each floor was shared by extended kin, business partners, and domestic staff. Privacy, as a spatial reality, simply did not exist. The Church, ever vigilant, understood this. The ecclesiastical regulations drafted at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 and refined throughout the medieval period acknowledged that marital intimacy must occur within a context of communal oversight. Priests were instructed to counsel newlyweds on the necessity of modesty, the avoidance of excess, and the importance of silence. Penitential handbooks written for confessors included detailed questions about the circumstances of marital relations. Had the couple ensured that children were asleep? Had they avoided holy days? Had they refrained from immodest speech? These questions reveal a system in which intimacy was not merely tolerated, but regulated, a necessary component of Christian marriage that had to be disciplined and contained. Court records from the Diocese of York between 1450 and 1530 include 47 cases in which neighbors testified about the sexual behavior of married couples, evidence that the walls, literal and metaphorical, were thin enough for the community to police. In one case from 1487, a woman named Agnes Wren testified that she had heard her neighbor, Marjorie Holbeck, refuse her husband's advances 3 nights running, a refusal that became grounds for a charge of marital abandonment. In another, a man named Thomas Clerk was accused of demanding intimacy from his wife on a feast day, an act witnessed by his apprentice, who slept in the same room. These records do not describe violations of privacy. They describe the enforcement of communal norms in a world where privacy was never assumed. The peasant cottage of medieval Europe was an instrument of social control as much as a shelter from the elements. In the villages of Picardy, archaeological excavations reveal single-room structures built with walls of wattle and daub, roofs thatched with straw, and floors of packed earth. The hearth was central, both literally and symbolically, the source of heat, light, and food preparation. Around it, the household arranged itself in a hierarchy determined by age, gender, and status. The head of the household occupied the place of honor nearest the fire, his wife beside him, children and servants arranged in descending order of importance. At night, this same space transformed into a sleeping hall, with straw mattresses, woolen blankets, and shared beds accommodating multiple sleepers. A survey conducted in the Burgundian countryside in 1397 recorded that the average peasant household contained 6.8 individuals, with 83% of dwellings consisting of a single multi-purpose room. Among the urban poor of Paris, the density was even greater. Tax records from 1421 list tenement buildings in the Marais district where entire families occupied single rooms, with multiple families sharing floors. In these spaces, the married couple's bed was not a sanctuary but a contested territory, a stage upon which the dynamics of power, affection, and obligation were performed before an audience that never left. They could not look away. There was no elsewhere to direct the gaze, no separate quarter to retreat into. Husbands and wives learned to conduct their intimacy beneath the pressure of constant surveillance, knowing that every sound, every movement, every breath could be heard, interpreted, and remembered. The bed itself became the primary mechanism for negotiating this impossible demand. Unlike the modern bed, which is a place of rest and solitude, the medieval bed was an architectural project, a zone of relative warmth and protection elevated above the cold, vermin-infested floor. The frame was constructed of wood, often the most valuable piece of furniture a family owned, passed down through generations. The mattress was a sack filled with straw, wool, or horsehair, depending on wealth. Over this, a series of blankets and coverlets were layered, creating a microenvironment that could retain body heat through the winter months. But the most critical feature was the curtain. Bed curtains, hung from a wooden frame or suspended from the ceiling, created a permeable boundary between the married couple and the rest of the household. These curtains were made of wool, linen, or, among the wealthy, embroidered tapestry. They blocked sightlines, muffled sound, and created the illusion of privacy, a psychological rather than physical barrier. Within this enclosed space, couples developed a repertoire of techniques for intimacy that prioritized silence and stillness. Movement had to be minimal, sound suppressed, breath controlled. The act of love became an exercise in discipline, a choreography of restraint performed in near darkness, the only light the faint glow of embers from the hearth filtering through the curtain's weave. Timing was the second mechanism. The rhythm of the household dictated opportunity. In the agrarian calendar, certain seasons offered more privacy than others. Spring, with its longer days and milder weather, allowed couples to leave the crowded house under the pretense of work in the fields, checking livestock, or gathering firewood. Summer harvest brought exhaustion, the entire household laboring from dawn to dusk, collapsing into sleep too profound to be disturbed. Autumn, with its festivals and the slaughter of livestock, created brief moments of communal distraction, ale flowing, songs sung, attention diverted. Winter was the cruelest season. The cold forced everyone indoors, the darkness compressed activity into a few hours, and the necessity of shared warmth meant that beds were often occupied by more than the married couple. In the households of the poor, children slept with parents well into adolescence, not out of sentiment but out of necessity. The shared body heat was survival. In this context, intimacy had to be negotiated with the children's presence in mind. Parents learned to wait until the deepest part of the night, when sleep was heaviest, when the children's breathing had settled into the slow rhythm of unconsciousness. They learned to move without waking, to touch without sound, to express desire through the lightest pressure of hand on hip, the faintest whisper of breath against skin. But even this timing was subject to external regulation. The church calendar imposed a grid of forbidden days over the year, restricting marital relations during Advent, Lent, Ember Days, and the vigils of major feasts. In total, the church prohibited intimacy on approximately 180 days per year, nearly half the calendar. Add to this the days when women were menstruating, the 40 days of purification after childbirth, and the weeks of visible pregnancy, and the opportunities for intimacy shrank to a narrow window. Couples learned to read this calendar with the same attention they gave to the planting and harvest cycles, planning their intimacy around the demands of faith and fertility. The story of Isabeau Torre and her husband, Gilles, offers a rare glimpse into how this system functioned in practice. Isabeau was the daughter of a wool merchant in the town of Arras, married at 17 to Gilles, a cooper 10 years her senior, in the summer of 1403. The couple moved into the home of Gilles' father, a two-room structure that housed 7 people. Gilles' father, his second wife, 2 half-siblings, an apprentice, and Gilles and Isabeau themselves. The marriage was arranged as most were, but the couple was expected to develop affection through proximity and shared responsibility. Isabeau's testimony, preserved in a church court record from 1410, provides extraordinary detail about the negotiations of intimacy in this household. She describes how, in the first weeks of her marriage, Gilles would signal his desire by placing his hand on her shoulder as they prepared for bed, a gesture invisible to the others but unmistakable to her. If she was willing, she would lean into the touch. If not, she would move away under the pretense of checking the children. She describes how they learned to speak in a private language, ordinary phrases that carried coded meaning. "The fire needs tending" meant he wished to step outside with her. "I'm not tired" meant she was willing to stay awake after the household slept. She describes the physicality of their intimacy, the need to remain motionless, the careful control of breath, the awareness that Gilles' father slept less than 6 feet away, separated only by a woolen curtain. But Isabeau's testimony also reveals the failures of this system. In the winter of 1407, Gilles fell ill with a fever that left him weakened for months. During this time, Isabeau slept beside him, tending to his needs, but intimacy became impossible. The household was too crowded, Gilles too weak, and the cold too severe. When Gilles recovered in the spring, Isabeau found herself pregnant within weeks, a pregnancy she later attributed to the pent-up longing of those winter months. She describes the conception with remarkable candor, noting that it occurred not in their bed but in the workshop after the household had gone to sleep. Gilles pulling her into the shadowed corner where the barrels were stored, the smell of wet wood and sap in her nostrils, the rough texture of the planks against her back. This was intimacy as stolen moment, as calculated risk, as defiance of the system that left no room for desire. The child born of that encounter, a daughter named Marguerite, became a reminder of what could be achieved within the constraints of communal living, proof that love could carve out space even where none existed. The consequences of this system were both social and psychological. On the social level, the lack of privacy meant that marriages were subject to constant external scrutiny and intervention. Family members, particularly mothers-in-law and elder relatives, wielded significant influence over the intimate dynamics of younger couples. In many households, the mother-in-law's presence was understood as a form of oversight, ensuring that the young wife submitted to her husband's authority and fulfilled her reproductive duties. This created a dynamic in which intimacy was not merely a private act between spouses but a performance subject to evaluation and judgment. Court records from late medieval France include numerous cases in which a husband's mother testified about the frequency or quality of the couple's marital relations, evidence used to support claims of impotence, infertility, or abandonment. Psychologically, the system produced a form of intimacy marked by anticipation, restraint, and coded communication. Couples learned to defer gratification, to find pleasure in the build-up rather than the act itself, to interpret subtle signals and respond with equal subtlety. This created relationships characterized by intense emotional attunement, a shared understanding forged in the crucible of constraint. But the system also produced pathologies. The lack of privacy could breed resentment, frustration, and shame. Women who found themselves unable to conceive in such constrained circumstances faced social stigma and suspicion. Men whose desire was thwarted by the logistics of communal living might seek intimacy elsewhere, in taverns, brothels, or clandestine affairs that offered the illusion of privacy. The Church's regulation of marital intimacy, intended to sanctify the act, often had the opposite effect, creating guilt and anxiety around what should have been a source of joy and connection. One artifact captures this tension with haunting clarity. In the municipal archives of Ghent, there exists a letter dated 1441, written by a woman named Caitlin van der Meer to her sister in Bruges. Caitlin describes her marriage to a mercer, a man she came to love deeply over the course of their 10-year union. But the letter is not a celebration, it is a lament. She writes of the frustration of sharing a bed with her husband's elderly mother, who suffered from night terrors and would wake screaming, disrupting any attempt at intimacy. She writes of the shame she felt when her husband, desperate for privacy, suggested they retreat to the barn, a space she associated with animals and filth. She writes, most poignantly, of the night her husband wept in her arms, not from sadness but from the sheer exhaustion of wanting and waiting, of desiring and deferring. "We have so little," Caitlin writes, "and yet we are asked to share even that." They could not look away, not from each other, not from the witnesses who filled their home, not from the system that demanded their intimacy be disciplined, delayed, and performed in the narrow margins of a life lived in public. The legacy of this system is not merely historical curiosity. It is a reminder that privacy, the ability to close a door and be alone with another person, is not a human universal, but a privilege won through centuries of social change. The couples of medieval Europe did not have this privilege, yet they loved, they touched, they whispered secrets in the dark. They learned to create intimacy not through isolation but through ingenuity, not through silence but through codes, not through abundance but through the fierce hoarding of stolen moments. Their strategies, their compromises, their small acts of defiance against a world that offered them no sanctuary, these are the inheritance they left behind. And perhaps the most surprising lesson is this, that intimacy, stripped of its modern trappings of privacy and space, revealed itself to be not a condition of the environment, but a choice, a daily recommitment to another person despite the odds, a quiet insistence that love could survive anything, even the gaze of witnesses who never looked away. In the end, the medieval couple lying beneath their wool curtain, their fingers intertwined, their breath synchronized in the cold darkness, understood something we have perhaps forgotten in our age of locked doors and private rooms. That intimacy is not the absence of others, but the presence of one. That love is not what happens when you are finally alone, but what you protect when you never are. They had no choice but to find ways to be tender in the noise, to be vulnerable before witnesses, to build a life together in a space no larger than a whisper. And somehow, impossibly, they did.